Welcome to the Massachusetts General Hospital Community Forum Friday, Session 8, Connecting Through Communication. My name is Katie Brandt. I'm the Director of Caregiver Support Services and Public Relations, and I am so excited to feature members of our speech and language program for today's important session. I am joined now by Megan Quimby. Good morning. Hello, Megan.
Good morning, Katie. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here.
Megan Quimby is the director of the Speech and Language Program for the FTD unit. She specializes in working with individuals with progressive language disorders, helping them by providing evaluation and treatment services that focus on facilitating functional communication. We're going to be talking about that today. Megan provides education to community-based organizations such as the Alzheimer's Association. And in the past, she has worked at Adult Day Health Programs, the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, and at Constant Therapy. Megan, I'm so excited to have you to kick off our session this morning. You bring such an important perspective, not only as the director of the program, but also as an experienced clinician working with so many families that struggle with communication challenges.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, yeah. I was hoping that you might start by just saying a few words about the speech and language program in the FTD unit.
Yeah, of course. We have I'm proud to say, a very large speech and language program at the MGH FTD unit. It consists of master's students, PhD students, clinical fellows, postdocs, and licensed clinicians in speech language pathology who really have a drive and passion to work with patients with primary progressive aphasia, early onset Alzheimer's disease, and other related disorders that we work with.
Yeah. And could you talk a little bit about why do we call our program a clinical research program? I think that's something that families, are curious about.
Yeah, I think it's because we focus on research a lot of our time, but as well as clinical care. So every Monday we have a clinic where we meet with patients and their family members and provide clinical care, as well as really do a lot of different research studies to focus on a cure, finding a cure, and thinking about the different treatment possibilities and the best ways to evaluate patients through research as well.
Yeah, it's always been so meaningful to me how Dr. Brad Dickerson, our director, will say that we are committed to providing the highest quality of care while working tirelessly towards a cure. And I am so proud of our program for having, both elements of that, because I know that's what families need.
Yeah, and I think it really drives the clinicians as well to be able to meet patients and families in a clinical way, as well as have them come through research. It really allows us to develop relationships with them that, at least for me, really drives my passion in working with all of these very unique and lovely people.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that something that's really important to let our families know, this Community Forum Friday session was launched during the time of pandemic. And we want everyone to know that we are still working, that families can still reach us for their clinical care questions, and we're also still working on research. Megan, can you talk a little bit about how do we work on research during this time?
Well, I know we have a lot of time to work on important things such as, how do we do virtual visits? How do we organize our data and, clean up our data and work on a lot of different projects because we're still connecting with team members through things like Zoom, like we're doing now. And I think we all have just as much drive to really work on these research projects as we did when we were in the office. It's just, I'm glad that there are virtual visits and we're working on having virtual visits just so we can connect with patients that way also, in addition to email and webinars such as these.
Yeah. And so we're recording all of these sessions and posting them on our MGH FTD unit YouTube channel so that folks can reference them at a time that's good for them. We recognize that people are still very busy and juggling a lot of things at home. And so we're happy to post these recordings so they can watch them whenever it's convenient.
Yeah, I think that's important.
Yeah. So, Megan, the topic of today, connecting through communication and functional communication, I bet that there are folks who don't really know what that term functional communication means. Could you help us understand that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So when we think of functional communication, we're really thinking about using individuals with diagnoses strengths to really get their thoughts, their feelings, their needs, their wants across in the best way they can. So it doesn't have to be a perfect way of communicating. Maybe someone's speech is not fluent, but really using other methods to get their message across the best way they can.
Yeah, and we know that this time, many of our families talked about how there were activities that they used to do, like going to an adult day health program, having dinners out, attending their local senior center, or just memory cafes, or going to the gym that they're not doing now. And they need to find new ways to connect. So we're hoping that that some of the tips and ideas that we have in this session will help folks think about how they can connect and maybe reduce some of the feelings of social isolation while social distancing.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think an important thing to keep in mind is if a caregiver and their loved one have activities in the home that they enjoy doing, such as listening to music or dancing or anything that provides connection, that
Mhm.
those are really important things to do if both of the people in the situation enjoy doing that activity. I think there's a lot of ways to provide connection that isn't just through speaking, for instance.
Yeah, and that's what we want to focus on today. That I loved what you said about feelings and thoughts and ideas, and that sometimes you can communicate a feeling with a look or, wanting to dance with your loved one in your kitchen, maybe even a hearty laugh at something that you hear on the radio or that if Alexa tells you a joke.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I am really happy that you're here to welcome everyone. Megan, I want to say that from working with our families, I hear so often how connected they feel with you and members of the speech and language program. And I want to thank you for all the work that you do in our community.
Oh, thank you, Katie. And I'm excited that other members of the speech team are here too, because it's really wonderful working with them. And I'm so proud of the work they do and through research and with patients and families. So you are well suited to learn a lot through them.
Yeah, so now we're going to transition. Megan, I know you have a lot of things to do and families and work to get caught up on. So thank you for taking the time to be with us this morning. And now we'll transition over to a panel where we're going to speak with 3 members of the speech and language program. Wonderful. I see Shaz is here today. Good morning. Good morning, Emmaleigh. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning.
And Jeanne, hello.
Hello.
It's so wonderful to have all of you here, and I want to take the time to introduce each of you to our community of caregivers and persons living with a diagnosis and community members so that we know who our expert panel is today. So I want to begin. Jeanne Gallée is a 4th-year doctoral student in the Harvard MIT program in Speech and Hearing Bioscience and Technology program. Her research is clinically focused on the area of primary progressive aphasia, where she explores the neural networks that are recruited to maintain or relearn language. In order to gain hands-on experience with PPA, she completed all coursework and clinical training for clinical certification in speech language pathology at MGH's Institute of Health Professions. She was awarded the Dingwall Foundation's Dissertation Fellowship in the Cognitive, Clinical, and Neuro Foundations of Language in July of 2019 and continues her work in our program. And next we have Shaz Henderson. Shaz is a licensed speech-language pathologist at the MGH FTD unit. She joined our team in January of 2018 as a graduate student and completed her clinical fellowship in July of 2019. She has a Master of Science degree in speech-language pathology from the MGH Institute of Health Professions. Clinically, she evaluates patients in areas related to speech and language and provides education and recommendations for patients and their caregivers. In addition, her research focuses on semantic cognition and its disorders in PPA. And now we have Emmaleigh. Emmaleigh Loyer joined the FTD unit as a graduate student in April of 2019. After earning a master's degree in speech-language pathology from the MGH Institute of Health Professions, she became a clinical fellow in September of 2019. Emmaleigh has a background in cognitive neuroscience, neuropsychology, and clinical research. Her role involves evaluating patients with PPA and related disorders, providing education and support to patients and caregivers, and contributing to ongoing research studies. She is particularly interested in functional communication in PPA and the utility of telepractice in treatment for neurodegenerative disorders. Wow, you guys are a great team, and it's always so exhilarating to read your bios. So as we begin our session today with you guys, I just want to thank you all for giving your time. I know how incredibly busy you are, and it's so important to bring expertise like yours to our community. I want to point out that while the speech and language program has a wonderful emphasis on primary progressive aphasia, that the communication techniques that we're going to talk about today, strategies and different approaches, are things that could work for anyone who's living with communication challenges. So whether you have a diagnosis of PPA or Alzheimer's disease or frontotemporal disorder, you can use these strategies, ideas, and plans to fit your specific situation. So, oh my goodness. What do you guys think about that beginning, right? Well, I think as we've set up the agenda, I thought that we would start with Shaz this morning. And one of the things that I love to talk about is this idea of that, like, the meaning matters. How do we use compensatory strategies to communicate? And I think actually to start, Shaz, could you even describe what is a compensatory strategy? What does that mean?
Sure, absolutely. So Katie, I think you bring up a really important question. And I often get questions from care partners I work with asking, my loved one has a neurodegenerative condition. So let's say, for example, primary progressive aphasia, short as PPA. And we know it's going to get progressively worse over time. So what can we do to enhance communication? As a speech language pathologist, the first point I usually make is that the approaches in speech therapy for PPA is actually quite different from the speech therapy and the approaches taken to treat aphasia resulting from a stroke or a traumatic brain injury, which a lot of them are focused on restoring the lost language functions. So in PPA, the aim is not so much on restoring the lost language functions, but rather to compensate for the lost functions. So when we typically recommend compensatory strategies to communicate, what we mean is to use language functions that are intact or preserved, and to also fortify available resources and consolidate the preserved functions and the resources to enhance functional communication with the ultimate goal of improving the quality of life for the individual living with PPA, as well as in communicating with their loved ones. So I think just to summarize what I said, when we say compensatory strategies, we're talking about techniques and modifications to compensate for a lost function or a deficit. So in the case of PPA, we're talking about a deficit in language and thinking about ways to compensate for this.
Well, and it sounds like what Megan was talking about when she was describing functional communication, and that it focuses on the person's strengths, right? So when you say resources, meaning the resources available to you as a person living with a diagnosis, maybe the resource that your care partner, loved ones, friends may have at their disposal, and things even in your environment.
Yep, as well as utilizing different types of therapies like speech language therapy, occupational therapy, music therapy. There are a lot of resources that might be available to you individuals as well.
And Shaz, there has been, you and Megan and the team have taught me about something called PAL that I really love because I'm not a speech language pathologist, but that's something that I've been able to hold in my head. And I was hoping that you might explain how that's a compensatory strategy, what it is, and then you and I could even like give an example of how we might use it.
Sure, absolutely. So let's say, for example, that your loved one has word finding difficulty in his daily life. And to compensate for this impairment, we may suggest a simple strategy that many of you may already know about or use or utilize in your day-to-day life called PAL, which stands for purpose, appearance, and location. So I think it might be helpful if I give an example. So let's say your loved one is having difficulty coming up with a word, but has the word in their mind, and they really struggle in coming up with this word. So using the PAL strategy, you as a loved one or a care partner can actually prompt these questions. So you can ask, what is the purpose of this item? What do you do with it? What does it do? So if, for example, your loved one is thinking about one particular item, let's see if everyone can guess this, they can say simply, you listen. That's the purpose. And for many of the care partners we work with, they're experts in knowing, exactly what the word that their loved one is thinking about. Whereas in other circumstances, it might take a while. You might need a little more information to really get at that word. So let's say we ask the next question. What's the appearance? What does it look like? Mm-hmm. So I can use gestures and words and say that there are two circles or two circular parts, and it goes here. So I'm using gestures and words, and I think everyone knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah, now I want to go get my my iPod and get ready to listen to some music.
Exactly. But for the purposes of this activity, you can ask where's the location or where do you find it? And it might depend or vary from one individual to another, as well as one home to another. In my case, it's actually in my desk. So I would point or say right here. And this is exactly what I'm thinking about in terms of explaining the purpose, appearance, and location of headphones.
Right, and I love the idea because the care partner can modify this. So when you say purpose, you could even ask specific questions like, is it something that you would eat? Is it something that you wear? And their loved one could answer verbally or like use the thumbs up, thumbs down.
Exactly, yeah.
Right. Wow, I really like that.
Thank you. And this is just one example. There are other word finding strategies as well. Simple things like using synonyms, antonyms, finding semantic associations. There's also a strategy called semantic feature analysis, which is a lot more detailed than the PAL. So you would have your loved one describe the group, the semantic category of what that item belongs in, what it's used for, what it does, as well as different properties. So like you said, Katie, I think that the care partner can actually prompt these questions and aid in coming up with the word.
Yeah, and Shaz, when you talk about semantic features, What would be another way that we could describe that for caregivers and persons living with a diagnosis? Like, what is a semantic feature?
Yeah, so it just means that it's semantically related to the item that you're talking about. So it could be the category. So if you're having difficulty coming up with the word cat, you can say that it belongs to the semantic category of animals. That's one way to think about it. Or you can also talk about the features. It has a tail or whiskers, or the sound that a cat would make. Meow, for example.
Right. Yeah, I love that. And thinking about just the goals, right? And that what's important here is the goal is not that you feel that it's your job to memorize or know a long list of words, but the goal is to connect and to communicate, and that you can do that in partnership. Yeah. Shaz, that's great. I think one of the other things is talking about the importance of, like, what are nonverbal ways that we're communicating when we think about our facial expression or body language, and why is that so important when we're talking about folks that might have trouble with like word retrieval strategy issues?
Absolutely. And I just wanted to start by saying that some of the things I talk about might overlap with what Emmaleigh and Jeanne will go over later on, just because when we think about compensatory strategies or nonverbal communication, a lot of these are intertwined. So I just want everyone to know that before I go in detail. But I think even in normal communication, we communicate with our facial expressions, we use gestures. I tend to use a lot of pointing or using conventional signs, for example. And our tone of voice can actually convey a lot about how you're feeling and your emotions. And these are also very important when communicating with individuals who have a language or other cognitive deficits as well. And before I get into a little more detail, I think it's also important to keep in mind that a strategy that works well for one family might not be the best strategy for another family. And we're talking about a wide range of diagnoses and different types of symptoms. For one individual, their strength might be language, whereas for another individual, their weakness might be in language. So I think nonverbal communication is important for all of the individuals that we work with, and they play an important role in different ways. So for instance, if we're talking about individuals with PPA who have significant word finding difficulty, using gestures might actually be a really efficient way to communicate, while the word retrieval strategies that we discussed, Katie, might be great. It might actually take a while to really understand what the word is. Whereas if the item that they're looking for or thinking about is right there, they can easily point to it and use gestures. So I think in that regard, using gestures can save up a lot of time as well as enhance communication. In other individuals, their primary deficit might be in executive functioning. So they have difficulty multitasking, and their ability to divide their attention to do two different things might be difficult for them. So some of the care partners that we've worked with have said that, I find myself yelling or my tone of voice gets raised when I feel like my loved one is not listening to me or not paying attention. And I think in those situations, what some of our care partners have expressed that they've found helpful is to reduce the external distractors. To think about, is my loved one not paying attention to me because the TV is on? Or is it maybe because my daughter is in the living room talking to their best friend, and there's just so many different factors that are being loaded in your loved one that they're actually not able to listen to you or pay attention to you. So I think in thinking about external distractions and really modifying the environment, coupled with your facial expressions, your body language, makes a difference in really having that enhanced communication between loved ones.
I love that. And I think as we move to Jeanne and then Emmaleigh, hear more about essentially what you're talking about is this trifecta approach of thinking about strategies that you can use, thinking about the environment, and then also just thinking about how can we communicate in nonverbal ways. And, I think we've really talked about challenges related to, say, memory, like recalling. But Jeanne, I think that you have some expertise to share with us about what happens when your loved one has their words, but it just takes time to get those words out. And I talk with a lot of caregivers who really would like coaching about this. Like, how do they support their loved one in this way?
Absolutely. I really enjoyed listening to you both talk about what the actual goal is of a conversation. And I think when your partner has received a diagnosis, I think one of the biggest challenges is that your relationship will have to adjust in some ways in response to any of the deficits that are, becoming more and more palpable in everyday conversations. So when you are in a situation where you're trying to communicate, but communication is breaking down due to either word finding difficulties, such as Shaz mentioned, or not because of language, because language is relatively intact, but the ability to really produce the language that someone is intending to, or being able to focus on a specific moment. I think the first thing to do is really to take a step back and recognize in that situation what will be most functional to enhancing the conversation. I think the acceptance that things will have to change or adjust from how they used to be will have to occur first, but then from there, recognizing, so my partner, my loved one wants to tell me something. Either is it breaking down at the level of they might not have processed what I said. So when I communicated something, was my partner able to understand everything that I said? Is it taking them longer to process? So does it just take a little bit more time where you just have to be a bit patient and wait for your message to fully come through? Or maybe is it the actual production phase that's impaired? So is someone trying to think of which words to use, or is someone unable to attend to which words they should be using? So I think this can sound very general, but I think it's important for everyone. I think I find myself in this situation where sometimes you have to think about what the actual goal is of that situation, of that conversation, and then to just take a step back and recognize, maybe, like Shaz was saying, it is the fact that things are pretty distracting, and that's why it's taking longer, or maybe this is just a new adjustment.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also thinking about different communication situations. So if you're home alone with your partner compared to being in a group, we've had some persons living with a diagnosis that have talked to me about how when they go out to dinner with their group of friends that they've always gone out with, or maybe they're at a family get together with all their relatives, and people are talking in a group, they want to join in, but it's hard for them to break into the conversation quickly, or they have the idea in their mind, but it's hard to get it out in a group setting. So do you have suggestions for the person living with the diagnosis about how to approach a situation where it's a group conversation environment?
Absolutely. So I think relying upon any type of additional support can be super helpful when you're in larger group settings. I mean, even once again, for myself and my own family, I sometimes have a hard time, knowing when to break into the conversation, being heard, and having visual supports, for example, can be super helpful. So having the ability to get attention by pointing to the exact object that you're trying to refer to. And it doesn't have to be something that's physically in front of you, but it could be something that you carry with you, if it's on your phone, if it's on a tablet, if it's in paper form, where you have those visual supports to then get a specific point across. I think that can be super helpful. Also coming up with a certain type of agreement with your family as well of, sometimes having a signal, having a gesture to indicate that you'd like to say something to break into the foray. think that can be very helpful.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I actually find that care partners and family members, they want their loved one to tell them what strategies work for them because they want it to be a partnership for communication. I really like what you're saying about nonverbal. So thinking about, beyond talking, when we're thinking about using nonverbal supports for communication, and that for some individuals who have communication challenges, they might be very strong with the written word. So could you talk about some of the ways that loved ones and families can use nonverbal supports?
Yeah. Coming back to the overarching message of finding what's functional for you and your partner, for you and your situation, I think anything goes. So if you, for example, can tap into a specific strength, such as writing, where actually speaking becomes more and more difficult, but writing seems to be okay. Having a notebook, writing down what you want to say, having pictures that are readily available for you to use, having gestures that make sense to you. I think one of the most important parts of all of these compensatory strategies is that they make sense to you and are unique to you. Because I know what's important to me, Shaz knows what's important to her, Emmaleigh knows what's important to her, but being able to come up with things that are important to you is what will make something useful to you. Right. So I think, especially when it comes to preserving the level of communication that you'd like to have with your partner, that can take place in any type of modality, in any form. And as long as you can get your point across using those types of supports, I think that's a great conversation. And so whether that ranges from having pre-recorded messages on a phone to any of the other ones that I had already mentioned, I think that is one of the best things that you can do in this situation.
I worked with one family who they made a special book in their house that had photos of loved ones with their name underneath. And the care partner would open the book and say, Jenny is coming over today, just as like a reminder and to communicate, to pair the word with the person. And they also had a section in their book for all the restaurants that they like to go to. So they collected takeout menus and then took a picture of the restaurant. And so they had the picture with the takeout menu and would flip the pages so they could decide. And those like visual cues help to say like, oh yeah, I really feel like chicken parm tonight, as opposed to Mexican food, because, it can be really tough if you have your heart set on one type of cuisine and you get faced with something totally different. Yeah. So I really thought that was so creative.
Yeah, and it reduces unnecessary barriers as well in those situations for things that used to be routine, and that just can really help that situation.
And for some of our loved ones where really they're not using language, and even things like simple signs, like for example, a stop sign in front of a door that you don't want your loved one to leave, or a smiley face in the morning next to the mirror for while they're brushing their teeth or shaving. Really think that these supports can cover the whole range of people living with different types of conditions at every stage. Yeah, well, that's wonderful, Jeanne. And, I think that one of the things that you're saying brings me to Emmaleigh, thinking about like those strategies where we're thinking about how we're communicating to someone and what can we do with our communication? Like, what are some of the things, Emmaleigh, that we can think about with our own language to make it easier to digest?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Katie. And there are many simple techniques that you can use to support communication. And many of them my coworker Shaz and Jeanne have already mentioned, but there are techniques you can use to just make very slight adjustments to the way that you're communicating information that will end up resulting in the same outcome of getting your point across without some of the frustration that may occur or lead to fewer communication breakdowns. And some of them you might know, but it's always good, as Shaz and Jeanne have both pointed out as well, that it's good to trial and error some of these strategies, because as things progress and your loved one develops different challenges, it's always nice to kind of go back to these and try to determine, okay, maybe I'll try this and see if now this will be more helpful to my loved one. So I think one that we hear a lot that's very helpful is just using short and simple sentences. It seems very basic, but for many people, myself included, I know it's very easy to, without even realizing it, provide a lot of information and when it's your time to speak. And it's important when you're working with people with dementia or communication difficulties to really break it down. And it can be helpful when someone's trying to process this information, especially true for people who have what we call auditory verbal working memory difficulties, meaning that they have difficulty processing a lot of information at one time. So allowing someone to kind of break it down and get simple pieces of information at once will likely yield better results.
Yeah, I think about how, many people know in this community, I am quite a talker. And and I'm also a caregiver for my dad with Alzheimer's. And I would find that sometimes, I'm sort of saying too much to him at once. Like I'll say, oh, Dad, Easter is coming up on Sunday. And so we're going to go to Lauren's house and have dinner, but I got to get Easter baskets ready for the kids. That's my sister. And Dad will say something like, the kids are going to be there, which is like the end of what I said. And really, so if you had all that information you wanted to share with your loved one, Emmaleigh, how would you break that down? What would be an example of how you can make that easier to digest?
Yeah, I think especially if you're like the example you gave, Katie, where you're trying to present a lot of information that's connected, but a little bit different, kind of providing one thing at a time. Like, for example, the kids are coming over, and then allowing a little bit of time for that to process. Then they can ask questions and you can elaborate. And then after that, moving to the next thing. And so we find a lot with our patients that people do a lot better. You provide them with one thing or a one-step task or command, and they're fine. They do much better with that versus giving them multiple steps to do. And then that's where it completely breaks down. So in your example, I would say really just providing one thing at a time and trying to be mindful that that modification will be really helpful and yield to more effective communicative exchanges.
Yeah, I find even breaking down the tasks. So sometimes folks get anxious about, say, going out to the store or going out to a doctor's appointment. So when you wake up in the morning, instead of saying, we got to get ready because you have to be at the doctor's at 10, you could start by saying, let's get out of bed now. And going to the bathroom. Now we're going to brush our teeth. Now we're going to get in the shower. And really, sometimes that information about where you're going isn't important until you're walking out the door or maybe even in the car. So just offering it in chunks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. And like you said, in addition to helping people process that information, it can relieve a lot of stress, and all of that information can be really anxiety provoking. So I think, as you said, using that chunking method is a really great way to help break down the information for people living with these conditions.
I feel like what we're talking about now has this nice blend with what we've heard before, in that you can make these things simpler and then continue to modify them as issues become more challenging. So maybe an early written calendar of the day's events has everything from, a 30-minute walk, oatmeal for breakfast, a phone call from their daughter. But maybe moving forward, it's just a picture of a sun for the morning and it says breakfast, or has a picture of eggs and bacon. And that you can really modify these things and make them as complex or as simple as works for your family.
Absolutely. And as Shaz pointed out too, it really is personalized. So doing, going through a strategy like that might work for 6 months or something. And then you start to notice that this isn't quite as effective anymore. So what kind of things can I do to either simplify or modify the strategies I'm using? And they will be much more effective oftentimes for your loved ones.
Emmaleigh, can you talk a little bit about changing your questions to prompt yes/no answers, and what could be the benefits of that as opposed to an open-ended question?
Yeah, and I think this again is one of those simple techniques that can really make a difference. So using yes/no questions can help with the effectiveness of your communication. For example, if someone has word finding difficulty or becomes overwhelmed by an open-ended question, this technique, by just saying, I'm going to ask you a question, whatever the question may be, and then it's a yes or no, allows them to really express their preferences and get their opinion across, give you a direct answer, rather than having to kind of retrieve all that information without any support. So allowing for that yes, no, or kind of forced choice is really beneficial, and make sure that they're still able to get their wants, feelings, needs across without feeling too overwhelmed.
And I know that some care partners have reported to me they feel concerned that their loved one, like if given a choice, do you want pasta or rice with dinner, that they always choose the last option given. And so sometimes I've encouraged folks to feel free to ask a question more than once to see if you get the same answer, or maybe to watch their loved one's facial expression, or ask them one thing at a time, like, do you want rice? And maybe showing them the box of rice.
Mm-hmm.
And try to take other cues, even in addition to the verbal responses.
So you kind of hit the nail on the head, I think, from what I was thinking as you were talking, is really using strategies like that, like using the physical item, like pick up a box of rice. And if they are having communication difficulties, using those other modalities like the facial expressions, or a thumbs up, thumbs down, shaking your head. All of those are different clues that I think you can use to really better understand what your loved one is thinking or trying to communicate, even if they're having difficulty producing the actual words.
Yeah, right. Emmaleigh, Shaz touched on this, and Jeanne, this idea of the environment. So especially during this time of pandemic, what do we think about things like, say, having the news on all day long? What kind of impact could that have on our loved ones that have difficulty processing words and language?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, because I think for most of us, as you said, in the pandemic, when everything is changing, it's really easy to have the news on in the background. And for many people, it can be distressing or anxiety provoking, especially with what's happening. And it's really important to be mindful of that. So in addition to that anxiety, it's also a way that you might find that someone becomes overstimulated, which is something that can be really difficult when you're trying to communicate with someone. So I think overall, thinking about those factors, like having the news on in the background, you want to make sure you're creating an environment that's the most conducive to promoting a successful communication. So keeping in mind those modifications in the environment that will reduce distractions and also remove any stimuli, like the news, for example, as you said, that can cause that stress and anxiety.
And I know for a lot of folks, it's really important to them. The news or watching TV to learn is an important part of their day. But we had a great presentation about home care. And one of the recommendations was to consider watching, say, National Geographic or the Discovery Channel for the opportunity to learn about subjects, but in a way that's less alarming.
Absolutely. I think that's a really great way to go about doing it, because, of course, for many people, that's something that they enjoy in their day, and kind of finding other methods to make sure that they're still staying stimulated and kind of filling that desire is really wonderful. And of course, if they do want to know what's going on in the news, it's been helpful. I've spoken with some caregivers who say, we keep it on in the morning for 10 minutes and then we spend a little bit of time talking about it together. So we both understand what's going on, and kind of talking through things to help alleviate some of the stress that they may be feeling but not communicating quite as much is another way to go about doing it. So they do feel like they're staying informed without experiencing so much of that distress or distractions throughout the day.
Yeah, I think that these are really important things for us to share with families at this time, because I think that while some of these suggestions might seem like second nature to us as we're working with families all the time, for many of our families, this is the first time that they've come up in front of a communication challenge such as this. And I really love it that the focus of our webinar today has been about connection. One of the things that Dr. Paul Rea talked about when we had our habilitation therapy session was to think about feelings first. So as we close out today, I was wondering if each of you wanted to reflect on the idea of connecting to emotions or ways that you could use any type of communication to express emotion for your loved ones. Jeanne, I think, when you're talking about the written word or whatever comes to mind.
Yeah. Well, I think just anything that you can use to bring back connection. So we had been talking about music before, or watching the National Geographic, or anything that doesn't tax any of the areas that might be more difficult, that might provoke anxiety as well, or even frustration. Where I know Shaz and Emmaleigh and I were talking about this yesterday, engaging in activities such as taking a walk, if that's safe in this current environment, knitting together, watching a show that might already be pretty popular in your household, where you don't need to understand every single line or every single action that takes place, but something that provides comfort, but also connection in the partnership.
I really love that.
Mhm.
Shaz, did you have a thought?
So I think personally for me, I have a lot of family across the globe. So I have my relatives in Korea, and my mom and my brother live in the Philippines. So our way to communicate is more through pictures and sending each other pictures every day, and just to see each other, even through pictures. It's such a strong connection, and it's a feeling to know that there's a lot happening in the world currently, but we're going to be okay, and we still have each other despite the distance, and we're going to go through it together as a family. So I think sharing pictures is a beautiful way to stay connected, especially during the current difficult times.
I really love that. That's beautiful. Yes. And Emmaleigh, did you have thoughts about this as well?
Yeah, I think kind of mirroring on some of the things, or echoing rather the things that you guys just said, really trying to think about your loved one's preferences and things that you used to do together that you really enjoyed, whether it be music, putting on your favorite artist or favorite song, watching movies together that you've enjoyed. Really just finding opportunities to spend quality time together without, as you said, Jeanne, putting so much reliance on verbal communication, language, or taxing the memory. I think there's a lot of difficulties that are associated with this staying at home and social distancing, but finding those opportunities to take advantage of a little bit of this time together can be really beneficial and help you share your feelings, emotions, and staying connected that you don't necessarily get when things like this aren't happening. So just trying to look on the bright side that there are new opportunities for connection during this time. And I think that that's really beneficial for not only our patients, but their loved ones as well.
Yeah, and really that just sometimes the emotion can drive the communication. So we know that one of the challenges that our patients experience can be like even initiating conversation. And so I love the idea of starting with an activity that you both enjoy, like knitting or listening to a song, or maybe the photo that you share prompts that conversation. And I think that these are new things that right? Just as Jeanne talked about the change and shift in relationship. So maybe you have to be the initiator in the conversation, but it can allow for those, feelings over facts and feeling first. That it's not necessarily the specific word that is the most important, but that we're able to connect through emotion and connect through meaning. Well, you guys have been a rock star panel. I loved it. Thank you so much for being a part of this webinar series. I know that our families benefit from your expertise, and I want to thank you all for being a part of our team and for all of the work and contributions that you put towards our community.
Thank you so much for having us.
All right. Well, I hope that everyone is staying safe and healthy, and we'll see you all again soon.